An Apache man abused his wife. That same night, her father, her brothers, and the men of the group appeared outside his wickiup. They didn't come to talk. They came to remind him where he stood, because that man was on her territory. He lived in her family's camp. He depended on them to remain part of the group. And in Arizona in 1850, that changed everything. If this speaks to you, subscribe now. Every week we publish history you won't find anywhere else. What you're about to hear today is not just the story of a people. It's the story of a protection system that functioned for centuries without police, without judges, and without written laws. And it's a system the 19th century world could not have imagined existed. In 1850, in the United States, a man could beat his wife and the law did nothing. That is not an exaggeration. It is a documented legal fact. Before the 1870s, no American state had a law criminalizing a husband's abuse of his wife. Alabama and Massachusetts were the first to pass one in 1871. Maryland followed in 1882. Until then, American courts applied the principle of non-intervention in domestic matters. It was a private problem between husband and wife, with no legal consequences for him. 80 kilometers from the American military forts in Arizona, Apache women lived under a completely different system. Not because anyone had written a law, but because the entire structure of Apache society made abusing a woman one of the most costly decisions a man could make. And to understand why, you first need to understand where that man lived. When an Apache married, he left his family of origin. He went to live with his wife's family. He built his life in her parents' camp, surrounded by her brothers, her uncles, the men who had spent their lives protecting her since she was a child. Anthropologist Morris Edward Opler documented this precisely in An Apache Lifeway, published in 1941 after years of fieldwork with the Chiricahua in the 1930s. Opler collected the direct testimony of an Apache informant who described the system this way. When the man marries, he goes to live at the camp of the woman's parents. We do this because a woman is worth more than a man. We do it to accommodate the woman. A woman is worth more than a man. That is not a phrase from a 20th century activist. It is the description a Chiricahua Apache gave to an American anthropologist of his own system, in his own words. And that principle was not only cultural, it was architectural. It was built into the way every family lived, into where each person slept, into who had the right to be on every piece of land. The wickiup, the Apache dwelling, was built and owned by the woman. Opler recorded it verbatim. The woman not only makes the household furnishings, but is responsible for the construction, maintenance, and repair of the dwelling itself, and for the organization of everything in it. That dwelling was hers. When the husband came into the marriage, what he brought with him was what he could take if he left. Nothing more. The house, the children, the household resources, all of it belonged to the woman and the matrilocal group that surrounded her. So imagine what it meant for that man to abuse his wife. He was not abusing someone vulnerable and without resources. He was abusing the daughter, the sister, the cousin of every man sleeping a few meters away. He was abusing the person because of whom he was there, the person whose presence made his place in that group possible, the person whose male relatives could literally the next day decide they no longer wanted him around. That was the first level of protection, the immediate social pressure of the group. There was no formal institution to file a complaint with, no court to appeal to. What existed was something more direct and more powerful than a court. Her entire family lived next door. The United States National Park Service, in its official description of the Ende, the Apaches, summarizes the matrilocal system this way. The husband lived and moved with the wife's family after marriage. That means that in the event of abuse, the woman did not have to go anywhere to find help. Help lived meters away. Hold on to that. Because the system had layers. And the next layer is what makes all of this even more remarkable. If the social pressure system didn't work, if the husband remained abusive, the woman had an option that no American woman of 1850 had without risking everything. She could end the marriage that same afternoon. The Apache divorce process was entirely unilateral for the woman. She took her husband's personal belongings, carried them out of the wickiup and left them outside. That was all. The marriage was over. He collected his things, left her family's camp, and returned to his group of origin. She kept the house, she kept the children, she kept her place within the group. Compare that with what an American woman had available in that same year of 1850. To obtain a divorce in the United States in 1850, a woman had to initiate a legal proceeding in court. She had to prove the abuse had been extreme and repeated. Courts demanded evidence. Husbands could defend themselves by claiming she had provoked him or that she had waited too long to file the complaint, what the legal terminology of the era called condonation of the abuse. Even when the divorce was granted, the woman frequently lost custody of the children because American law assigned legal authority over children to the father. And if the husband owned the house, she left with what she was wearing. That same year, an Apache woman in Arizona could end an abusive marriage in an afternoon and keep everything. If this video is striking you, like it now. And leave a comment. Did you know Apache women could divorce like this, while that protection didn't exist in the United States? But there is something more in this system, something that goes beyond divorce and social pressure, something that touches the core of how the Apaches understood a woman's value within the community. For the husband to have reached that position, he had to go through a negotiation process that placed him in debt to his wife's family from the very first day. Apache marriage was not an agreement between a man and a woman. It was an agreement between a man and the woman's family. The suitor, or his family, offered horses and other goods to the woman's father as part of the negotiation. Once those goods were accepted, the marriage could happen. There was no formal ceremony, but there was a public acknowledgement that that man had taken on obligations. What obligations? Opler documented them with a level of detail that leaves no ambiguity. The son-in-law had the obligation to hunt for his father-in-law's family, forever. The term the Apaches used to describe that obligation has a literal translation that Opler collected from an informant. It means that the man's business is to hunt for his in-laws. It is his obligation to do so forever. Forever. Not during the honeymoon period. Not during the first years, forever. That man entered the marriage knowing his position depended on fulfilling that obligation. If he abused his wife, he was putting at risk not only his relationship with her, but his position within the group he now belonged to, his access to the hunting resources of the territory, his relationship with the men who hunted alongside him, his reputation in the only social group he had at that point, because he had left his group of origin behind when he married. And there is something more in this system that makes everything click together in a way outside observers took decades to understand. The Apache avoidance protocol prohibited the son-in-law from looking directly at his mother-in-law. They could not be in the same room without an intermediary. If he had something to communicate to her, he had to do so through a third person. This practice is documented in the records of the Encyclopedia of North American Peoples and in Opler's fieldwork as the most elaborate of its kind in the entire American Southwest. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that man lived in a territory where one of the figures of greatest authority, his wife's mother, had a relationship with him that was formally tense by design. It was not friendly. It required obligatory respect. He had to provide for that family, even without being able to communicate with her directly. That is the level of dependence the husband had within the Apache system. He was not a guest in his wife's home. He was someone who had entered a system of mutual obligations where he contributed work and resources, and the group gave him belonging, protection, and territory. If he broke the rules of that arrangement, the group could simply withdraw. And without the group, in the Arizona desert in 1850, a man alone did not survive. That is what made the system function as protection. Not because anyone had designed it to protect women, but because the structure of Apache society made abusing a woman also a form of social suicide. Now comes the part of the system that cost American observers of the 19th century the most to understand. The consequences for the man who abused his wife did not end with the divorce. When a man was expelled from his wife's matrilocal group, he had to return to the group of origin he had left when he married, and that return was not silent. The reason for his departure was known. Apache groups were small. In the period before the reservations, a typical local group had between 20 and 50 people, according to the ethnographic records of Opla and the Arizona Historical Society. In that context, there was no anonymity, no possibility of rebuilding an image. The man who had abused his wife and been expelled returned marked, and that mark affected his chances of marrying again, because any new family considering that man as a suitor for their daughter knew what had happened. The mother of the next candidate, the one who held the real authority over the household he hoped to enter, factored that information in. The system had memory. For American women in 1850, the situation was exactly the reverse. A woman who left an abusive husband was often socially stigmatized. She could lose her standing in the community. She could lose custody of her children. The husband, by contrast, was free to remarry with no formal consequences. In Arizona that same year, it was the man who bore the social consequences of the abuse, not the woman. Apache women did not only have structural protection within marriage, they had something harder to quantify, but equally real, a position within the system that made their well-being a collective interest. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes the Apache matrilineal system this way. The basic socio-economic unit was the matrilineal extended family, a group of one or more related women, their husbands, their unmarried children, their daughters, their sons-in-law, and their grandchildren. The women were the permanent core. The men were the ones who rotated. That means that when an Apache woman was abused, she was not an isolated victim in a house that belonged to her abuser. She was the center of a network of people who had built their lives around her. Her well-being directly affected the functioning of the entire group. Perhaps that is why one detail the military records of the era never fully processed appears in descriptions of Apache society. Divorce was easy and could be initiated by either party. Easy for her, costly for him. Return to the man in the opening scene. The one who abused his wife and saw the men of the group appear outside his wickiup that same night. He knew exactly what that meant. It was not a vague threat. It was the concrete materialization of the entire system he had chosen to enter when he married. He had entered knowing the rules. He had entered knowing she was worth more than he was within that structure. He had entered knowing his position depended on fulfilling his obligations. If he chose to ignore that presence, the consequences were clear. Divorce, expulsion, return to his group of origin, the reputation, the difficulty of ever establishing new bonds. Most did not ignore it, and that is what made the system work without police, without judges, and without written laws. It worked because abusing a woman had a real, immediate, and measurable cost for the man who did it. Not in the future, not in theory. That same night, that was operating in Arizona in 1850, while American lawmakers debated whether women should have the right to own property, while American courts decided that domestic abuse was a private matter, while women in the cities of the eastern United States had no legal way to protect themselves without risking their children, their home, and their social standing. 80 kilometers from the military forts trying to subdue this people, there existed a system no American politician of 1850 could have designed. A system that placed the cost of abuse on the aggressor, not the victim. If you made it this far, you just heard something that most history books don't even mention. Leave one single word in the comments describing what you felt hearing this. Just one. I want to see how many people make it to the end. And if this channel is giving you history with real sources that you can't find anywhere else, subscribe now. Every week there's a video like this one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story.